And the most memorable verse to me from this story is what Jesus said to Martha. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. I think that this is a very important verse that we should all remember, and it comes from this story. David started out last week putting some emphasis on verse 14 when he said, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. And so once again, Jesus is going to perform a sign whose purpose is to impress the people, but also to convince the disciples. And then he comes back to this idea at the conclusion of the story. In verse 38, we finish this story, and it says, Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. I knew that thou hearest me always, but I've said this on account of the people standing by, that they may believe that thou didst send me. When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with bandages and his face wrapped with cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. Okay, so this story concludes with the raising of Lazarus, and this is the peak, I think, of the miracles that Jesus did. This is a greater miracle than changing water to wine, and it is Jesus' most prominent and memorable miracle, I think. Now, in the next section, we can review this story about the chief priests that we've talked about before. In 1 Peter 1, there is a verse that said, The prophets who prophesied of the grace which was to be yours searched and inquired about this salvation. They inquired what person or time was indicated by the Spirit of Christ within them when predicting the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glory. And so the prophets did not know when Jesus was coming. They did not know who it was to be. They prophesied about things that they did not understand fully. And that's what Caiaphas did in this story. Let's look at verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. This is just like when he healed the blind man. The reason that the Pharisees knew about the healing of the blind man was because someone went and told them. And once again, people go and tell the Pharisees what's happened. And so the people are still divided over Jesus, and people can see a miracle that would stun everyone. I mean, if you saw a person raised from the dead, how could there be any unbelief in you?
Especially when you knew that they were dead.
Exactly. Jesus made sure that they knew that Lazarus was dead before he did this. And yet people have watched something that we would wait our entire lives or more lifetimes to see. And yet when it happened, they went to the Pharisees and tattletaled on Jesus. And so that the Pharisees, let me get Bob to read this. Verse 47 through 53, Bob.
So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on thus, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was a high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all." I'm sorry, where is it? How far?
Through 53.
You do not understand that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation shall not perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they took counsel how to put him to death.
Okay. It is almost beyond belief that people can witness a thing like this and yet want to suppress it, even to the point of breaking the law of Moses in all the ways that they did during his trial and crucifixion. And so Caiaphas did not know the implications of what he said. He said something that had one meaning to him, but that was actually a prophecy about the redemptive act of Jesus' death. And also that the whole nation should not perish, and that in doing this, he would gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And so that's what Caiaphas said. Okay, Jesus no longer went about openly among the Jews, but went from there to the country near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. And now once again, the crowd are in the background making comments about the things that they see. They're making comments as a group. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. And so they lived in a time and place where if a person decided to go 10 miles away in one direction, that was a great separation. They didn't have the ability to communicate instantaneously that we have. And so they had to have a word from a person who might travel a long distance and come back a long distance before they could know anything. And so Jesus was separated from them in a way that you could never do today. And so they're all uncertain about what Jesus' intentions are and what he's going to do. Now, we're going to go into chapter 12. There are 4 records in the Gospels of women who anointed Jesus. And those are Matthew 26 and Mark 14. And these are, I think, without a doubt, the same story. In the Synoptic Gospels, Mark and Matthew tell exactly the same story. And there are enough characteristics of these 2 stories that you know that they are identical. And then we have this story in John 12 that bears enough resemblance to those stories in Matthew and Mark that it seems like the same story. And then there's a fourth story, and that is in Luke 7. And I think that it would be good for us to read that story because it has a lot of characteristics that do not seem like the story in John 12, and yet something similar happens. And so in Luke 7, verse 36, that's where this story is. And so, Tom, why don't you read that story? Why don't you read verse 36 through Luke 7, yeah. And so think of the unique characteristics of this story. There are certainly things in it that sound like the story that we'll read in John 12, but this is a different story, I think, and you'll see why. And so as you go through, try to identify the characteristics of this story that make it seem different from the one in John 12. We're not going to read the one in Matthew 26 or Mark 14 because they're a lot like the one in John 12. Okay, why don't you read verses 34 through about 39.
The Son of Man, on the other hand, feasts and drinks, and you say,
Hold on. Have I? Luke 7:36.
oh, what's this, 34? Okay, the heading on this one in my Bible says Jesus anointed by a sinful woman.
Okay.
One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to have dinner with him. So Jesus went to his house and sat down to eat. When a certain immoral woman from the city heard he was eating there, she brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. And she knelt down at his feet, weeping. Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting the perfume on them. Keep going.
Yeah, read down through 40.
Okay. When the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, they said to him, if this man were a prophet, he would have known what kind of woman is touching him. She is a sinner. And Jesus answered his thoughts. Simon, he said to the Pharisees, I have something to say to you. Go ahead and teach her, Simon said.
Okay. Rush, we're in Luke 7. Why don't you read in just a minute, beginning with verse 41 through the end of the chapter.
Ready when you are.
Okay. Let's think about some of the characteristics of this that make it unique. What do you notice about this story? Brother Bray, do you have, what makes this a different kind of story?
One of the things I see is the lady was a sinner coming to Jesus, and she was being very hospitable to him. And
Right.
the Pharisees, they said, well, if he is who he says he is, he should have known that and not allow her to, be doing the things she was doing.
That's right. The cardinal feature of this story to me is that this woman is, number one, from the city, whatever that means, and that she's a sinner. Doesn't tell what kind of sinner she is, but the Pharisee knows about her and knows that there's something bad about her. And this seems like that would not be a characteristic of the women that are in the other stories, and in particular, the story in John 12. So that is, to me, the cardinal feature of this story. You might be able to say that Simon the leper is the Pharisee. Simon the leper is the man whose house this took place. The story took place in Matthew 26 and Mark 14. And you might say, well, that Simon the leper was the Pharisee, but perhaps not. But you almost can't harmonize these other stories with the story of this woman who is so much of a sinner that the Pharisee says in his mind, this man can't be a prophet, because if he were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this was, and he would not be a willing participant in this. And so the great aspects of this story are the aspects that make it resemble the story of the woman taken in adultery, that Jesus wants to accept people who have been sinners, and he wants their sins to be forgiven. Because we know that Jesus came to seek and to save the saved, right? No, he came to seek and save the lost. And so this woman has come, and he wants to save her. And so okay, so let's Rush, go ahead and read verses 41 through the end of the chapter.
Luke 7:41. There was a certain creditor who had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and one the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, you have rightly judged. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair on her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Then he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace.
Okay. I consider this one of the great stories of the Gospels. It's great enough that a lot of the great artists painted pictures of this. And if you Google dinner in the house of the Pharisee, you'll find lots of paintings, and they all look kind of like this, where there are people sitting around, and the woman is washing Jesus' feet. This is a great, great story because of the things that it teaches. It teaches something to the Pharisee, and it teaches something to the woman, and everyone should put himself in the place of the Pharisee, I think, and imagine the judgments that we impose on other people, and then also put ourselves in the place of the woman, realizing that Jesus wants to forgive sinners. He came to seek and to save the lost. And so we always think of John 3:16 as, you know, if you're going to a football game and you were going to hold up a verse, it would be John 3:16, right? But John 3:17 is an important verse because it says that God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. So anyway, he forgives her sins, and this is kind of like the story of that man who was brought in by his friends, where they took the tiles off the roof and let him down into a crowded house. And when Jesus saw him, he said, "Your sins are forgiven." And the Sadducees and the people that were around him said to themselves that he was blaspheming. But then he went ahead and said, "But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." Then he said to the man, "Rise, take up your bed and go home." And he went home. And so Jesus demonstrated the ability that he had to forgive sins through the miracles that he performed. So this is a great story, but you can see some of the cardinal features of this story. And to me, the most outstanding one is that the woman was the sinner.
Probably another thing on that, to me, it shows that we need to humble ourselves.
Yes,
I mean, how many of us have washed feet for somebody else?
right. Yes. Uh-huh.
Humble ourselves is I think is another lesson in that as well.
Yes, right. Were you going to say something, Rush?
Yeah, Bobby, I don't know if you've made the point that, but I think this drives home that a sin is a sin. He does not distinguish between sins. It doesn't matter what she did. It could be anything.
Right, and I think that that we have our favorite sins to condemn. I've got my favorites, and most of them are sins that don't trouble me. And we do sort of create a hierarchy of sins that we think that are so much worse than others. You can sort of, fill in the blanks of this, and I think that's a very good point, that there should not be a hierarchy of sins, and we should be aware that when God looks at us and our sin, we are as needing of grace and redemption as the people that we want to condemn are. I think that's a very good point. Okay, let's go back to any more comments about that? Okay, let's go back to John 12 then, and think about this other story that bears some resemblance to it. And so as we go through this, think about the things that make this story similar to the previous story, and think about the things that make it different from the previous story. Okay, 6 days before the Passover. And so we're seeing this as probably in the last week or so. And if you look forward just a little bit, just glance at the next chapter, you will see that we recognize the things that begin in chapter 13 as being the things that are right at the end of Jesus' life, beginning with the next chapter. And so we are close to the time when Jesus is going to be crucified. Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at table with him. Mary took a pound of costly ointment of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box that used to take what was put into it, Jesus said, "Let her alone. Let her keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." So, what makes this most like the previous story? What aspect of this story makes it resemble the previous story the most? Number one. Brother Bray, what makes it most like the previous story?
What I see here is, when we talk about sinners and non-sinners here, we could say, this is the Christian, the other lady was a sinner. And you expect this from the friend, but you would not expect it from the other lady.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Whose house did this take place in? Can you tell whose house it took place in? It says that Martha served, right?
Right.
Okay.
I would assume Lazarus' house.
You assume that. Does it say that? It doesn't say that. And so we don't know whose house this took place in. Was it the house of the Pharisee? Was it the house of Simon the leper? Or was it the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? It doesn't say. We know that Martha served, but how many times have you gone to somebody's house for a potluck and you were serving at someone else's house, right? Any comments about that? Okay, so we don't know where this took place. Martha served. Now, something that makes this look just like the previous story, to me, is what was actually happening. The fact that a woman came in, took expensive ointment, and anointed the feet of Jesus and anointed Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. Doesn't that make it sound a lot like the previous story? Just like it to me. And yet, is Mary, who did this, the woman who was the sinner from the previous story? It doesn't seem like it. And so, it seems like Mary is not a woman of the city who is a sinner. We think of her as a virtuous person, right? So that makes it different. But anyway, something similar took place, something similar with regard to the thing that the woman did, that Mary did. When we characterize Mary and Martha by the things that we know about them, what did Jesus say to Martha that we sort of think as a slogan that tells something about the character of Martha? What did Jesus say to her? He said, "Martha, Martha." And he said that because at a time when Jesus was being served, Martha was upset with Mary because Mary was listening to the stories of Jesus and not helping her serve. And so we think of Martha as the person who was preoccupied with getting things done, and we think of Mary as the person who sat at Jesus' feet and listened to him. And I think we just sort of give this little shorthand characterization of Mary and Martha. But Mary did sit at his feet and listen to him. Okay, and now we know this thing about, we hear this thing about Judas, which in Matthew 12 and Mark 14 is not attributed to Judas specifically, but is attributed to the disciples as a whole. And that is that they looked at the use of this expensive ointment in this way as a waste. And, Jesus went through all of these cities, and he had an entourage who went with him. He had people who went in front of him and announced that he was coming. He had people who got places for them to stay. They had, we have references in Matthew to many women who accompanied him from Galilee ministering to him. And so Jesus, when he went through the countryside, he was with a group of people that were carrying out all kinds of actions that were necessary when a speaker would come to town, gather crowds, and speak and heal. When we went to Panama for medical mission trips, there would be a large group of people that would go. Some people were cooking, some people were teaching the Bible. We had ophthalmologists who took care of people's eyes. We had dentists that took care of their teeth. And we had doctors and nurses and people that were passing out toothpaste and toothbrushes and soap and so forth. And that's the type of thing that Jesus had, I think. I have pictures of us sitting around at lunch and the children coming up and playing with us and grabbing our feet and things like that. And just as Jesus had when he told the disciples to let the children come to him, for of such was the kingdom of heaven. So that's the kind of situation that they're in. And one of the things that had to be done was somebody had to be the treasurer. In addition to the people that were cooking and arranging that sort of thing, somebody had to take care of the money. And it happened to be Judas that took care of the money. That's what he did. And so the ministry of Judas was as treasurer to take care of the money. And it says in here that sometimes he reached into the money bag and took a little for himself. I'm sure that he had a good reason for doing this. He said, to himself, I do such and such. I'm one of the apostles. Jesus has chosen me because of the judgment that I have, because of my wisdom. And in my wisdom, I think it's a good idea to take a little money and do something for myself, I suppose.
Like a fox in the hen house, wasn't it?
That's right. And so that was Judas, and but he, not only Judas, but the other disciples judged the woman for wasting this money in such a way. But Jesus is within the last week of his life. And imagine what Jesus, the trajectory of Jesus' thoughts as he progressed from the beginning of his ministry to the last week of his life. Jesus started his ministry, and shortly after that, John the Baptist was put in prison. And then later on, John the Baptist was executed. He was beheaded. And what do you think that Jesus thought when John was beheaded? He thought, I'm next. I think that Jesus, as he got closer and closer to his crucifixion, he tried to tell the disciples about what was going to happen. But surely he was also imagining this in his mind. Imagine if you knew that in 1 week something was going to happen to you that was just horrific, and that you were going to die the sort of death that Jesus died. I think he knew this, and I think that as he got closer and closer, the things that people did for him, like what Mary did, And what the disciples did in the garden, when they fell asleep, these must have had made a great impression on him. Because, he was not just this story in black and red like it is in my Bible, but he was aware of the upcoming ordeal that he was to go through. And when someone said something as petty as what Judas or the disciples said about what this woman did for him, that must have been must have had a great impact on him. And so she did something that was very kind and thoughtful of him. And then the disciples, or Judas in this case, said something that was just ignoring what Jesus was about to go through. When Jesus was trying to train his disciples, one of the things that he did was he told them what was going to happen. The first time he told them in Matthew 16, it says that Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be killed and on the third day be raised. And Judas took him and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you. And then the next time, and so he had a great negative response to what Jesus said to him when he said, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and be killed. Judas had a very negative response. The next time, in Matthew 17, he told the disciples a similar thing, and it says they were greatly distressed. But then in the 20th chapter, he told them a third time, and there was no significant response. And so Jesus had this crescendo of events that he knew would lead to his death. And this was one of the things that took place. And he said, she has done a beautiful thing to me. And he said, it will never be forgotten wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world. So, and then one other thing he said, the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. And so I think it is something to think about what it meant when he said, the poor you always have with you, but you will not always have me. I think that we do think of the money that we give, the decisions that we make regarding money in the church as being guided by the need to make every penny count. And so we just have to think about this and try to understand what it means when it says, the poor you always have with you, but you will not always have me. Anybody have a comment about that, an interpretation of it?
Bobby, I do have one comment, not on that particular topic. I was just thinking that the two women also had one thing in common, in that I believe that they both were true believers, and that they were honoring Jesus by doing that because they had such faith that he was the Savior.
I think that's right. We know that the woman in Luke 7 had great faith because he said so, right? At the end of that story, he said, your faith has saved you. And so I think that is correct. And so it was faith that led them to perform this act. I think that it is a characteristic of women that they have this impulse like that, and that it is the characteristic of men to say, this money was wasted on this, right? And so, I think that that women are always writing little cards for each other, right? They're sending little sweet texts and all that stuff, and but that pretty much men are just joking around or down to business, I think.
Never refer to it as wasting.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, it was not wasted. I think, let's let that be the end of the class, okay? All right.